Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Job. Today we're going to be looking at chapters 7 and 8. And as promised, we will hear from Job's friend Bildad today, but not until chapter 8. So let's begin with chapter 7. If you remember, Job is throwing himself a pity party here, kind of, and honestly, I can understand why. He's been faithful to God, and he's really done nothing wrong, but he's still had all these bad things happen to him anyway. It doesn't seem fair, but as the great Stephen A. Smith likes to say, fair is a place where they judge pigs. What that means is that life sometimes isn't fair, okay? So Job here in chapter 7 is continuing to complain about all of the things that he's having to go through. And again, I'm not faulting Job. I'm not saying that Job's in the wrong here for doing it, but that is what he's doing. He's complaining about the situation he's going through. And he talks in those first 5 verses about the futility, misery, and emptiness of his life. He actually sounds like he's expecting his life to end soon if you read through verses 6 to 10. It's pretty clear that Job is struggling with all that he's faced, but that only goes to show that Job was human, okay? He's just like us in a lot of ways. He didn't have some divine gift that allowed him to deal with these difficult times. All he had was his faith in God, and he maintained it through everything. But if you look to verses 11 to 16, he actually says that he wishes God would just leave him alone. And you can see that in verse 16. Remember, he's already said that he wished that he died in childbirth. So like this really isn't that far off from that, right? Job wondered why God would allow all these things to happen to him when he'd done nothing wrong and nothing to deserve it. So what we're seeing here in this opening round of speeches between Job and his friends is a pattern. His friends attack, and Job responds by saying that he's innocent. And what he really wants is to hear from God why all this is happening to him. And that brings us to chapter 8, where we meet his friend Bildad. Now, Bildad opens with the same kind of accusation here that Eliphaz had as well. Job had sinned against God and was suffering righteous judgment because of it. Now, Bildad was big on justice, and we can see that in verse 3, and then again in verses 8 to 10, because he points back at the past and how every other time people had faced the judgment of God, it was because they'd done something wrong. So naturally, he assumes that since Job is suffering and that Job has faced all these judgments from God, that he must have acted godlessly. He must have done something wrong. And he even says there in verse 20 that God will not cast away the blameless. So basically he's saying, if God has rejected him, if God has allowed these things to happen, it must be because that Job lacked integrity. So remember, Bildad isn't necessarily wrong for most situations. Like, these things are typically correct, but obviously with Job's case, that he is an exception. So this is not really the advice that he should be giving. This is the way God operates, but this situation is an exception. God's ways are mysterious and hidden from us unless he chooses to reveal them. Sometimes God doesn't make sense, and in those times we just have to accept that God is in control and he has a plan. Now, believe me, I know that's much more difficult than it sounds, but that's what we are called to do. We are called to have faith, and that God will count that faith for us as righteousness. We've seen it all throughout the Bible. We see the results when people have faith in God. When you have faith, God is there, and God is a God that keeps his word, even when it doesn't seem easy, even when it's not easy, even when it doesn't seem fair. God is faithful, and we are to reward his faithfulness with faithfulness in him of our own. So you can see also in Bildad, he was a little rough, and a little more rough than Eliphaz. Now, Eliphaz kind of started gently, but Bildad, he comes right out swinging. He talks about Job's children in verse 4, even though he had no knowledge of them doing anything wrong. He just jumps to conclusions. Now, that was not fair of him, and he was, in fact, in the wrong when he does this. They'd done nothing to deserve what had happened to them, and their only real crime here was being children of Job. And now, honestly, because Job is the only one mentioned as being righteous and faithful, we know that his children probably, weren't the most righteous people. Okay, whatever, but it doesn't say that they have done anything, they were killed as judgment for that. It just says that they were taken basically because they were Job's children, and Satan was allowed to do whatever he wanted to come at Job, just he couldn't touch Job himself. And so their lives ended the way they did and when they did, basically just because they were related to Job. And he also goes on in verses 5 to 7 to tell Job to just ask for the Lord's mercy. he and Eliphaz both have this idea that all Job has to do is admit to God what he's done wrong and he'll be forgiven. Now, guys, this wasn't true for Job in this situation because he hadn't sinned. He hadn't done anything wrong. But it is true for us. When our lives are unraveling because of the choices we've made and we're just digging our hole deeper and deeper, and we know that we're running from God because we're afraid to turn and ask him for forgiveness and ask for his mercy. It's not going to get any better until we do that. It's not going to get any better until we confess. We confess what we've done and we ask for his forgiveness. We ask for that mercy. And that's a big takeaway for us here, guys, in these couple chapters here of Job. When we sin, when we make mistakes, we need to confess them, and God will be faithful to forgive us and to cleanse us from all our unrighteousness. He promises us that in the New Testament. Now, obviously, again, Job is an exception here because Job has done nothing wrong. He's got nothing to confess. Okay, he has no need for the Lord's forgiveness for his sins because he's being tested here. And Job has been faithful, and we'll see how all of this continues to play out as we get back here next week. So until then, I will see you tomorrow in the book of Isaiah.